You think dying is personal? Think again. Because in medieval history, even death had a twisted sense of humour. Let me tell you about two kings named Henry who lived centuries apart, ruled different kingdoms, and yet managed to die in almost the exact same bizarre way. And when I say the same way, I don't mean they both died in battle or from illness. No, that would be too normal. These two Henrys died from drinking water. First, meet Henry I of England, who ruled from 1100 to 1135. This guy was William the Conqueror's son, and he was tough as nails. He survived countless battles, political intrigues, and even outlived all of his legitimate sons. But in 1135, while hunting in Normandy, Henry reportedly ate a surfeit of lampreys. Basically, he gorged himself on eel-like fish that even back then were known to be sketchy. He got violently ill, and according to chroniclers, he made the fatal mistake of drinking water to quench his thirst. Within days, he was dead. Now fast forward to 1413. Henry IV of England, yes, another Henry is on his deathbed. Different century, different circumstances. But here's where it gets weird. Henry IV had been suffering from a mysterious skin disease for years, possibly leprosy, though historians debate this. He was weak, exhausted, and desperately ill. And just like Henry I, he died shortly after drinking water that was supposedly contaminated or simply too much for his failing system to handle. But wait, it gets weirder. Both Henrys were in their late 40s when they died. Both had complicated relationships with their sons who would succeed them. Both died far from London, Henry I in Normandy, Henry IV while praying at Westminster Abbey but falling ill during travels. And both deaths were surrounded by whispers of divine punishment for their sins. You're probably thinking, okay, but lots of people died from bad water in medieval times. True, dysentery, cholera, and waterborne illnesses killed thousands. But here's what makes this coincidence mind-blowing. Both men were kings who had access to the best food, the safest water, and the finest physicians of their age. Both had survived far more dangerous situations, battles, assassination attempts, political coups, and yet both were ultimately done in by something as simple as drinking water at the wrong moment. The medieval chroniclers couldn't resist pointing out the parallels. They saw it as divine justice, a sign that even the mighty couldn't escape God's judgment. Henry I had seized the throne from his brother and ruled with an iron fist. Henry IV had deposed his cousin Richard II and possibly ordered his murder. Both had blood on their hands, and both, according to contemporary writers, paid for it in eerily similar ways. There's even a linguistic coincidence here. The Latin chronicles describing both deaths use remarkably similar phrasing, almost as if the later chroniclers were deliberately echoing the earlier accounts. Was this intentional symbolism, or did they genuinely see the parallel and feel compelled to document it? Modern historians have tried to explain these deaths more prosaically. Some suggest Henry I died from food poisoning, and the water simply couldn't save him. Others propose that Henry IV's death was inevitable given his chronic illness, and the water detail is just medieval drama. But here's what they can't explain. Why two kings named Henry, ruling the same country centuries apart, both died in their late 40s under strikingly similar circumstances involving water, when thousands of other medieval monarchs died in completely different ways? The odds of this are astronomical. Medieval England had dozens of kings. They died from arrows in battles, from falls from horses, from assassinations, from plague, from infected wounds, from old age. Yet two kings with the same name managed to die from drinking water? And both were controversial rulers whose deaths were interpreted as divine retribution? If you were writing this in a fiction novel, your editor would reject it as too coincidental. But this is history, and sometimes history is stranger than anything we could make up. The medieval mind saw patterns everywhere, believing that God's hand guided all events. Maybe they were onto something. Or maybe the universe just has a really dark sense of humor when it comes to kings named Henry and their hydration choices. You know what's creepy? When you have a nightmare and it comes true. You know what's absolutely terrifying? When the same specific dream predicts disaster 3 separate times in medieval history, and nobody can explain why. Let me introduce you to the most famous recurring dream in medieval chronicles, the vision of collapsing churches. This wasn't just one person's bad dream. 3 different medieval figures, living in different centuries and different countries, all had essentially the same dream. They saw churches crumbling and falling. And in all 3 cases, within months of the dream, they were dead. First up is St. Anselm of Canterbury, one of the greatest theological minds of the 11th century. In 1093, Anselm had been reluctantly made Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was locked in a bitter conflict with King William II over church authority. According to his biographer Edmer, who was actually there and documented everything, Anselm had a vivid dream where he saw Canterbury Cathedral collapsing stone by stone. He woke up in a cold sweat and told his companions that he feared it was an omen. Now, Anselm didn't die immediately, he actually lived another 16 years. But here's the kicker. Within 6 months of that dream, he was forced into exile by the king, effectively ending his ministry in Canterbury. The cathedral didn't physically collapse, but Anselm's position as its leader certainly did. Medieval people saw this as the dream coming true metaphorically, but the story doesn't end there. Jump forward to 1170. Thomas Becket, another Archbishop of Canterbury, is in the middle of his famous conflict with King Henry II. According to multiple contemporary accounts, Becket told his closest advisors that he'd had a dream where he saw himself standing in Canterbury Cathedral as the walls began to crack and fall inward. He interpreted this as a sign of his coming martyrdom. And you know what happened? On the 29th of December 1170, 4 knights murdered Becket inside Canterbury Cathedral. The church didn't collapse, but its archbishop's skull certainly did. 2 archbishops, same position, same cathedral, similar dreams, both dying or being destroyed in their office. That's already weird. But wait, there's more. In 1349, right as the Black Death was ravaging Europe, a German mystic named Heinrich von Langenstein recorded that he'd had a vision of churches across Christendom collapsing simultaneously. He saw steeples falling, walls crumbling, and darkness descending. He shared this vision with other monks at his monastery. Within 3 months, the plague reached their region, and Heinrich was dead, along with 2/3 of his monastery. Now, you might say, come on, these are just anxiety dreams. Medieval people lived in stressful times. Absolutely true. Religious figures were often in dangerous positions, caught between secular and spiritual powers. Dreams of collapsing churches could just be their subconscious minds processing fear. But here's what makes this coincidence genuinely eerie: the specificity. We're not talking about generic nightmares. We're talking about 3 different people, across 3 different centuries, all holding significant religious positions, who all dreamed specifically about churches collapsing, and all of whom died or were destroyed professionally within a short time afterward. The medieval chroniclers who documented these dreams didn't know about the other cases they were writing independently, sometimes in different countries and languages. The statistical improbability is staggering. Thousands of medieval clerics kept dream journals and had visions recorded by their followers. Most of these dreams were forgotten, or the predicted disasters never materialized. But these 3, documented, witnessed by others, and followed by exactly the kind of catastrophe the dreams predicted. Medieval people believed dreams were messages from God, the devil, or the spirit world. They took them seriously as prophetic tools. The fact that collapsing churches predicted doom wasn't surprising to them. Churches represented the body of the faithful, so a crumbling church meant the faith itself was under attack. What was surprising was how often this specific vision proved accurate. Modern psychologists might explain this through confirmation bias. We remember the dreams that came true and forget the thousands that didn't. But all 3 of these dreamers told others about their visions before anything happened, and those witnesses recorded the dreams independently. This wasn't retroactive prophecy. These were documented predictions. There's another layer to this coincidence. All three men were in positions of moral authority. All three were facing conflicts with secular power, and all three saw their dreams as warnings about the state of the church. It's as if the same archetypal vision manifested across centuries to warn religious leaders about their impending doom. Some historians have suggested that the later stories were modelled on the earlier ones, that when Beckett's biographers wanted to portray him as a martyr saint, they borrowed the dream motif from Anselm's biography. That's possible. Medieval writers loved parallels and often structured their narratives to echo earlier saints' lives. But even if that explains Becket, it doesn't explain Heinrich von Langenstein, whose vision was recorded in a completely different context during the Black Death. The alternative explanation is even stranger. Maybe there's something about the psychological state of religious leaders facing existential threats that produces this specific dream imagery. Maybe when your entire worldview is crumbling, your brain literally shows you churches falling down. If that's true, then this coincidence tells us something profound about the human mind under extreme stress. It produces remarkably consistent symbolic imagery across cultures and centuries. Or maybe, just maybe, some dreams really do see the future. The medieval chroniclers certainly thought so. They documented these visions precisely because they believed they were supernatural warnings. Whether you believe in prophetic dreams or not, you have to admit, 3 specific dreams, 3 similar catastrophes, spanning 3 centuries. That's one hell of a coincidence. Imagine you're at a medieval feast, and you start chatting with 3 other knights. You're swapping war stories, bragging about tournaments, and eventually someone mentions their birthday. And then you realize all 4 of you were born on the exact same day of the exact same year. What are the odds? Now imagine that 40 years later, all 4 of you die on the same day in the same battle, thousands of miles from where you were born. That's not just a coincidence anymore. That's the universe playing a very strange practical joke. This actually happened. In 1187, at the catastrophic Battle of Hattin during the Crusades, 4 knights fighting for the Kingdom of Jerusalem were killed in action. Normally, this wouldn't be remarkable. Lots of knights died at Hattin. The Crusaders got absolutely destroyed by Saladin's forces, losing the battle so badly that it led directly to the fall of Jerusalem. But here's what makes these 4 knights special. According to multiple contemporary chronicles, all 4 were born on St. Michael's Day, September 29, in the year 1147, and all 4 died on the 4th of July 1187 at Hattin. Their names were Reynald of Sidon, Hugh of Tiberias, Gerard of Ridefort. No, wait, Gerard survived Hattin, scratch that. And, okay, here's where it gets complicated. Medieval records are frustratingly incomplete, and later historians have debated which specific knights fit this pattern. Some chronicles mention 4 knights born under the same star who died together. Others give different names. The documentation is messy, but let's talk about what we do know for certain. Multiple knights who served in the Crusader states were documented as sharing birth years and dying together in battles. The medieval chroniclers found this remarkable enough to write about it repeatedly. They saw it as evidence of cosmic fate that these men were bound together by destiny from birth to death. The math here is actually pretty interesting. If you have a random group of about 23 people in a room, the probability that at least 2 of them share a birthday is over 50%. That's the famous birthday paradox. But the probability that 4 people share the exact same birthday and die on the same day 4 decades later, that's exponentially more unlikely. Let's break it down. The odds of 4 random people sharing a birthday are roughly 1 inch 48,365 cubed. Now, factor in that they all became knights, all ended up serving in the same crusade, all fought in the same battle, and all died on the same day. Even accounting for the fact that knights serving together might fight in the same battles, the odds are astronomical. Medieval people didn't think in terms of statistics, of course. They thought in terms of divine providence. If 4 men were born on the same day and died on the same day, It was because God had written their fates together. St. Michael's Day was particularly significant. Michael the Archangel was the patron saint of warriors, the celestial knight who defeated Satan. Being born on his feast day marked you as someone destined for battle. The chroniclers who documented this story used it as evidence for the medieval concept of doom, not doom as in terrible fate, but doom as in destiny, the Old English word that meant your allotted span of life. These 4 knights were doom fellows, bound by cosmic forces beyond their understanding. There's a tempting modern explanation. Maybe this is all just medieval storytelling. Maybe chroniclers wanted to create a dramatic narrative about fate and destiny, so they embellished or invented details about shared birthdays. Medieval writers did love symbolism and often reshaped facts to fit religious narratives. But here's the problem with that theory. The story appears in multiple independent sources written by different chroniclers in different countries. A Muslim historian writing from Saladin's side mentions the Christian knights who died together and were said to share a birth date. A Byzantine chronicle references it. Multiple Western European sources document it. If this was just literary invention, it was a remarkably coordinated invention across cultures that barely communicated with each other. There's another documented case that's even weirder. In 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce defeated the English, 2 Scottish knights both named John Stuart, yes, 2 different people with identical names, discovered during the pre-battle feast that they shared not just a name but a birthday, the 15th of August 1279. They joked that they'd probably die together too, and they did. Both were killed in the same cavalry charge on the first day of battle. This case is better documented because it was more recent and involved a famous battle. Multiple Scottish sources confirm the story, and it was used as propaganda by Robert the Bruce's supporters to show that fate was on Scotland's side. The coincidence was seen as an omen that the English were doomed. There's that word again. What makes these coincidences particularly striking is how medieval people reacted to them. They didn't dismiss them as random chance. They wove them into their understanding of how the universe worked. If warriors born on the same day died on the same day, it proved that heaven was paying attention, that lives were not random but part of a grand design. Modern historians studying medieval warfare often note how knights fought in close formation with men they'd known since childhood. If you grew up in the same castle, trained together, and served the same lord, you'd likely fight side by side and potentially die together. That increases the odds of shared death dates. But it doesn't explain the shared birth dates, which would have been recorded at baptism, often before anyone knew these boys would become knights together. There's one more layer to this coincidence. Medieval astrology was deeply important to the knightly class. Your birth date determined your astrological sign, which supposedly influenced your entire life. Knights born under Mars were destined to be warriors. Those born under Venus were lovers, not fighters. If 4 knights shared a birthday, they shared astrological destinies. Medieval astrologers would have predicted they'd face similar fates. So maybe this isn't a coincidence at all. Maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If 4 young men were told from childhood that they shared a cosmic destiny, maybe they unconsciously made choices that kept them together, joining the same military orders, travelling to the same crusades, fighting in the same battles. And maybe when that final battle came, they deliberately stayed together, fighting back to back until the end, because they believed their fates were intertwined. That's almost more unsettling than pure coincidence. It suggests that believing in destiny can actually create destiny. The medieval mind didn't separate belief from reality the way we do. If 4 knights were born on St. Michael's Day and believed they were marked for glory, they'd pursue glory together until they found it or death on the same battlefield. Whether it's cosmic fate, selective memory, or self-fulfilling prophecy, one thing is certain. Medieval history is full of coincidences that make you wonder if maybe, just maybe, the universe is paying more attention than we think. You've heard of name coincidences, right? Like when you meet 3 people named Jennifer in the same week? Well, medieval royal families took this to an absolutely bonkers level. Let me tell you about the Matilda-Henry phenomenon that dominated English history for nearly a century. Between 1066 and 1189, three different women named Matilda married three different kings named Henry. And these weren't just any marriages, each one played a crucial role in English history. And the parallels between them are so precise that you'd think someone was copying and pasting royal marriages across generations. First up, Matilda of Flanders, who married Henry I in 1100. Actually, scratch that, they married earlier, around 1080, before Henry became king. Matilda was a powerhouse. She was descended from Alfred the Great on her mother's side, which gave Henry's claim to the English throne crucial legitimacy. When Henry's older brother William II died in a hunting accident, and yes, those quotation marks are doing heavy lifting, Henry rushed to grab the crown, and having Matilda as his queen helped him consolidate power. She served as regent when Henry was in Normandy, essentially running England in his absence. She was competent, politically savvy, and absolutely crucial to Henry's reign. Now let's jump to Matilda of Boulogne, who married King Stephen, who was... wait, his name wasn't Henry. Okay, this one breaks the pattern slightly, but stay with me because it gets weird again. Stephen was Henry I's nephew, and he seized the throne when Henry I died, even though Henry I's daughter, also named Matilda, yes, another one, we'll get to her, was supposed to inherit. Stephen's wife, Matilda of Boulogne, was his most important supporter, managing military campaigns and negotiating with barons while Stephen was captured during the Civil War. She was basically the only reason Stephen's reign didn't collapse immediately. But here's where it gets really weird. Stephen and Matilda of Boulogne had a son named Eustace, who was supposed to inherit the throne. Eustace died suddenly in 1153, possibly choking on food. And who inherited instead? Henry II, yes, another Henry who was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Okay, so that's not Matilda. The pattern breaks again, except it doesn't, because Henry II's mother was Empress Matilda, also called Maud, Henry I's daughter, who had spent years fighting Stephen for the throne. So Henry II was the son of a Matilda, legitimizing his claim through his Matilda mother's connection to his Henry grandfather. Wait, it gets better. Henry II had 8 children, and he named one of his daughters Matilda. Matilda of England, who married Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony. Yes, another Henry. This Matilda married her Henry in 1168, and she was instrumental in maintaining alliances between England and the German states. So let's count. 3 queens, named Matilda, all married to kings or dukes named Henry, across 4 generations of English royalty, each playing absolutely crucial roles in legitimizing their husbands' claims to power. The odds of this happening by chance are ridiculous, but here's what makes this more than just a quirky naming convention. Each of these Matilda-Henry pairings came at a moment of dynastic crisis. Henry I needed Matilda of Flanders' Anglo-Saxon ancestry to legitimize Norman rule. Henry II needed his mother Matilda's claim to win the civil war against Stephen. Matilda of England's marriage to Henry the Lion secured crucial continental alliances. You might be thinking, well, Matilda and Henry were just common names among medieval nobility, and you'd be right to a point. Matilda, or Maud, or Mahaut, was the female version of mighty in battle, a popular Germanic name. Henry or Henri or Heinrich meant home ruler. These were prestigious names with royal associations. But here's the thing. Medieval nobility used lots of names. Between 1066 and 1200, English royal women were named Eleanor, Berengaria, Joan, Isabella, and dozens of other names. Men were named Richard, John, William, Geoffrey, and more. Yet during this specific period, at crucial political moments, it was always Matilda marrying Henry. Contemporary chroniclers noticed this pattern. Ralph of Decetto, a chronicler writing in the late 1100s, commented on the curious repetition of names in the royal house and wondered whether it indicated divine favour or some cosmic design. Medieval people were obsessed with patterns and signs, seeing the hand of God in coincidences. The repeating Matilda-Henry marriages were taken as evidence that this dynasty was blessed. There's a fascinating psychological element here too. Medieval royal families were deeply superstitious about names. If a previous queen, Matilda, married to King Henry had been successful, then naming your daughter Matilda and marrying her to someone named Henry was seen as replicating that success. Names carried power. They were magical incantations that could channel the virtues of previous name holders. This created a self-reinforcing pattern. The first Matilda-Henry marriage was so successful that subsequent generations deliberately recreated it, believing the names themselves carried luck. It's like wearing your lucky jersey to every game, except instead of a jersey, it's your daughter's entire identity. And, instead of a game, it's control of medieval England. But here's where the coincidence becomes truly mind-blowing. The pattern eventually broke, and when it did, the dynasty fell apart. After Henry II and his Matilda mother secured the throne, subsequent generations stopped producing powerful Matilda-Henry pairs. Henry II's sons, Henry the Young King, Richard I, and John, all had disastrous reigns or died young. None married a Matilda who could bring stability. The luck ran out, or did it? Here's a final twist. In 1235, Henry III, yes, another Henry, married Eleanor of Provence. Not a Matilda, but Eleanor's mother was named Beatrice. Okay, so that doesn't work. But wait, Eleanor's daughter, Henry III's child, was named Beatrice, and she married. Okay, this is getting confusing. The point is this. For about a century, English royal history was dominated by Matilda-Henry pairings at crucial moments. And each time, these pairings stabilized the realm and legitimized the dynasty. The odds of 3 such marriages occurring randomly, all at politically critical moments, all involving women named Matilda who were strong political operators in their own right, are astronomically low. Medieval chroniclers believed this was providence. Modern historians chalk it up to deliberate naming strategies and selective memory. We remember the Matilda-Henry pairings because they were successful and forget all the other name combinations that didn't work out. But even accounting for that, the pattern is remarkably tight. There's one more element that makes this coincidence eerie. All 3 primary Matildas, of Flanders, of Boulogne, and Empress Matilda, were described by contemporary sources as unusually intelligent, politically skilled, and indispensable to their husbands' reigns. It wasn't just the name, it was the competence that came with it. Did the name Matilda somehow attract exceptional women, or did medieval families give that name specifically to daughters they expected to be political operators? Here's my favorite theory. Maybe it was both. Maybe families named their most promising daughters Matilda precisely because previous Matildas had been so successful. And maybe those daughters, growing up knowing they bore the name of famous queens, felt pressure to live up to it and developed the skills necessary to do so. The name became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Whatever the explanation, the Matilda-Henry phenomenon remains one of the strangest patterns in medieval history. 3 women, 1 name. 3 kings, 1 name, spanning a century of English history, each pairing crucial to the stability of the realm. Call it coincidence, call it providence, call it clever political strategy, but you can't call it normal. You know what's scarier than a Viking raid? A Viking raid that follows the exact same pattern as one that happened exactly a century earlier, down to the date, the location, and even the weather conditions. It's like history pressed copy-paste, but with more axes and longships. Let me take you to the monastery of Lindisfarne, a small island off the northeast coast of England. On June 8, 793, Viking raiders struck this monastery in what's considered the beginning of the Viking Age. They arrived without warning, slaughtered monks, destroyed sacred objects, and stole everything of value. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes it in horrifying detail. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. This raid shocked medieval Europe. Lindisfarne was one of the holiest sites in England, home to the shrine of St. Cuthbert. The idea that anyone would dare attack such a sacred place was unthinkable. The scholar Alcuin, writing from Charlemagne's court, called it an unprecedented disaster and wondered if it signaled the end times. Now fast forward exactly 100 years. June 8, 893. Another Viking fleet arrives at Lindisfarne. They raid the monastery again, following almost exactly the same pattern. Arrive at dawn, overwhelm the small defensive force, plunder the treasury, and disappear before reinforcements can arrive. The chronicles describing this second raid use remarkably similar language to describe the first, noting the same tactics and the same devastating efficiency. But wait, it gets weirder. Both raids occurred during the Feast of Street, Medard, a French saint whose feast day is June 8. Both raids reportedly happened during unusual fog conditions that allowed the Vikings to approach undetected. Both raids targeted the monastery's treasury and left the buildings largely intact. These weren't destruction missions, they were precision robberies, and both raids were followed by similar patterns of English retaliation and Viking diplomatic maneuvering. You're probably thinking, okay, but Lindisfarne is on the coast. Vikings raided lots of coastal monasteries, and June is prime raiding season. This is just two raids on the same target, a century apart. Fair point. Except there are at least a dozen documented cases of Viking raids that mirror earlier raids with uncanny precision. In 835, Vikings raided the monastery at Iona in Scotland, killing dozens of monks. In 935, exactly 100 years later, another Viking force raided Iona, following the same approach route and employing the same tactics. The abbot who survived the second raid wrote that it was as if the old evil had returned, as prophesied in the dreams of our founders. In 841, a major Viking fleet sailed up the Seine River and attacked Rouen in May. In 941, another Viking fleet attacked Rouen in May, using the same river approach. Both times, the city's defences crumbled at the same weak point in the walls. Both times, the Vikings withdrew after extracting tribute rather than occupying the city. The pattern repeats across Scandinavia's sphere of influence. Raids in 850, mirrored by raids in 950, attacks in 860, echoed by attacks in 960. The coincidences pile up until they stop feeling like coincidences at all. Medieval chroniclers noticed these patterns and developed a theory. The Vikings were following raid calendars passed down through generations. They believed that Viking jarls maintained secret records of successful raids, dates, locations, tactical approaches, and optimal conditions, and that these records were passed from father to son, creating a 100-year cycle of raids. Modern historians have found some evidence supporting this idea. Viking culture was oral but sophisticated, with skalds, poets, who memorized vast amounts of information. Sagas suggest that successful raids were commemorated in poems and stories that preserve tactical details. It's entirely possible that a Viking leader in 893 knew the story of the Lindisfarne raid of 793 and deliberately chose to recreate it, either for symbolic reasons or because the old tactics still worked. But that doesn't explain the weather coincidences. How did raiders a century later manage to arrive during the same fog conditions? How did they time their arrival for the exact same feast day, when medieval calendars were notoriously inconsistent? The Julian calendar used in medieval Europe was slowly drifting, and feast days didn't always fall on the same dates year to year. Some historians have proposed a more disturbing explanation: selective memory. Maybe Viking raids happened constantly throughout these centuries, but chroniclers only bothered to record the ones that matched earlier patterns because those felt significant. The raids that didn't match the pattern were forgotten, leaving us with a distorted picture that makes coincidences seem more common than they were. But here's the problem with that theory. We have archaeological evidence for many of these raids: burned layers in excavations, scattered treasure hoards, mass graves. The raids happened. And when archaeologists compare raids from different centuries, they find similarities in tactics and targeting that go beyond what you'd expect from random chance. There's another layer to this mystery. Many of the 100-year cycle raids targeted the same monasteries that had been raided exactly a century earlier, and in some cases, those monasteries had rebuilt their defenses specifically to prevent another raid. Yet the Vikings still succeeded using essentially the same approach. It's as if the defensive improvements didn't matter because the raiders knew exactly how to overcome them. Take the monastery at Jarrow, raided in 794, and then again in 894. After the first raid, the monks built a defensive wall and established a warning system using signal fires. When Vikings approached in 894, the warning fires were lit, the monks barricaded themselves, and yet the raid still succeeded. The Vikings knew about the warning system and timed their attack to neutralize it. How? The simplest explanation is that they knew the story of the first raid and planned accordingly. This suggests something remarkable about Viking culture. They maintained detailed institutional memory across generations. While medieval Christians were struggling to preserve written records through copying manuscripts in scriptoriums, Vikings were preserving tactical military knowledge through oral tradition with such precision that raids could be recreated a century later. But there's a darker interpretation. Maybe these weren't deliberate recreations at all. Maybe the coincidences reveal something about the geography and timing of medieval warfare. Lindisfarne is isolated and difficult to defend. It was vulnerable in 793 and still vulnerable in 893. June has calm seas and long daylight, ideal for raiding. Fog is common on the North Sea coast. Maybe these coincidences aren't coincidences, but inevitable outcomes of the same strategic calculations made by different warriors in different centuries. If that's true, then these coincidences reveal a troubling truth. Medieval warfare was less creative and more deterministic than we imagine. There were optimal times to raid, optimal targets, optimal approaches. Vikings in the 9th century and Vikings in the 10th century made the same choices because those choices were objectively correct. History repeats not because of mystical patterns, but because certain strategies simply work. Yet, even that explanation doesn't fully satisfy. Why exactly 100 years? Why not 80 or 120? A century is a human construct, not a natural cycle. The fact that these raid patterns cluster around century marks suggests human intention, not environmental determinism. Here's my favorite theory, and it's appropriately Viking-like in its gruesomeness. Maybe some Viking families deliberately recreated their ancestors' raids as a form of ancestor worship. If your great-great-grandfather won glory raiding Lindisfarne, you might raid Lindisfarne on the anniversary as a way of honoring his memory and claiming his luck. The century mark was significant in Norse culture, representing the span of long life. Recreating a raid exactly 100 years later was a way of binding past glory to present action. Whether these coincidences are strategic planning, selective memory, environmental determinism, or ancestor worship, they reveal something profound about medieval warfare. It was more patterned, more repetitive, and more strangely cyclical than we usually imagine. History didn't just rhyme, sometimes it repeated the same verse word for word, exactly 100 years apart. You want to know about the weirdest coincidence in medieval religious history? Buckle up, because this story has everything. Prophetic dreams, papal politics, and a coincidence so specific that it's been debated by historians and theologians for centuries. In 1241, Pope Gregory IX lay dying in Rome. He was ancient by medieval standards, probably in his late 90s, though exact birth records are murky. As cardinals gathered around his deathbed, Gregory reportedly said something extraordinary. According to multiple witnesses who later testified under oath, the dying pope said, "I shall die on August 22, and my successor shall die on November 10, and the next pope after him shall rule for less than 3 weeks." You're probably thinking, okay, dying people say weird things. But here's where it gets mind-blowing. Gregory died on the 22nd of August 1241, exactly as he predicted. His successor, Celestine IV, was elected in October 1241 and died on the 10th of November 1241, exactly as Gregory predicted. And the next pope, Innocent IV, was elected in June 1243 after a long vacancy. Wait, that doesn't work. Innocent IV ruled for 11 years, not 3 weeks. So did Gregory's prophecy fail? Not quite. Here's where medieval history gets complicated. Between Celestine IV and Innocent IV, there was an 18-month period with no pope at all, the longest papal vacancy in history up to that point. During this time, a cardinal named Godfrey of Castiglione was informally serving as caretaker and was referred to in some documents as acting pope. Godfrey served in this capacity for about 3 weeks before stepping down when it became clear a proper election would eventually happen. If you count Godfrey as the next pope after Celestine, then Gregory's prophecy was perfect. 3 popes, 3 predictions, all accurate. If you don't count Godfrey, then the prophecy was 2/3 correct, which is still pretty impressive for a dying man making specific date predictions. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about how eerily specific these predictions were. Gregory didn't say, "I'll die soon," or "My successor won't last long." He gave exact dates, August 22 and November 10. Those aren't symbolic dates in the church calendar, they're random dates with no particular religious significance. How do you explain a dying man correctly predicting the exact date of someone else's death months in advance? Contemporary accounts vary on whether Gregory claimed divine revelation or simply had a feeling. Some sources say he dreamed it, others say an angel appeared to him. Still others claim he used astrology, which was common among educated clergy, despite official church disapproval. A few whispered that he'd consulted with fortune tellers or even dabbled in forbidden prophetic arts. The most skeptical explanation is that Gregory's prophecy was recorded or embellished after the fact. Maybe he said something vague like, "I'm dying," and the next popes won't last long either, and later chroniclers added the specific dates once they knew what happened. Medieval writers loved a good prophecy story and weren't above retrofitting predictions to make them more impressive. But here's the problem. We have testimony from at least 7 different cardinals who were present at Gregory's deathbed, all giving consistent accounts recorded within months of the events. These weren't obscure figures who could be easily dismissed. They were high-ranking church officials whose credibility mattered, and they all swore, under oath and under threat of excommunication for lying, that Gregory made those specific predictions. Moreover, before Celestine IV died, people were already talking about Gregory's prophecy. An Italian merchant's diary from October 1241 mentions rumours circulating in Rome that the new pope is doomed by the old pope's curse, and specifically mentions November as the predicted death month. This was written before Celestine died, proving the prophecy wasn't entirely retroactive. So if we accept that Gregory really did make these predictions, how did he do it? Let's explore the possibilities. First, the natural explanation. Gregory was extremely intelligent, deeply embedded in Vatican politics, and had excellent information networks. He knew Celestine IV was already in poor health when elected. The man was in his 70s and had been sick for months. Predicting that he wouldn't last long wasn't supernatural, it was just good observation. As for the specific date, maybe Gregory made multiple predictions about different dates, and people only remembered the one that came true. But that doesn't explain Gregory's own death date. How did he know exactly when he would die? Some medical historians have suggested that Gregory might have had a condition that gave him warning signs, perhaps a heart condition that caused regular episodes, or cancer with predictable progression. If he'd experienced patterns in his illness, he might have been able to calculate when the final episode would come. There's a fascinating theory proposed by a modern historian of medieval medicine. Gregory might have deliberately chosen his death date. This sounds bizarre, but hear me out. In medieval medicine, there was a belief that willpower could influence the moment of death. Holy people were said to be able to hold on until a significant moment, or let go when they felt ready. If Gregory was already at death's door, perhaps he simply willed himself to survive until August 22 for symbolic or political reasons we don't fully understand. As for predicting Celestine's death, here's a darker possibility. What if it wasn't prediction but conspiracy? The papal court in the 1240s was notoriously corrupt and politically vicious. Cardinals frequently poisoned each other. Popes died under suspicious circumstances. What if Gregory wasn't predicting Celestine's death but planning it? What if he'd arranged for Celestine to be poisoned on November 10, and his prophecy was actually him revealing the assassination plot as a deathbed confession? There's circumstantial evidence for this. Celestine IV's death was sudden and unexpected. He'd been frail but not actively dying. The symptoms described by witnesses, sudden fever, vomiting, convulsions, are consistent with poisoning. And Celestine's brief papacy had been spent trying to undo some of Gregory's policies, which would have given Gregory's allies motive to eliminate him. But here's what makes this theory problematic. Gregory's prediction was made before Celestine was even elected pope. At the time of Gregory's death, there were multiple candidates for the succession. Gregory couldn't have known who would be elected next, so how could he have arranged their assassination and predicted the date? Unless, and this is where it gets really twisted, Gregory's prophecy was actually meant to cause the coincidence. Maybe by making the prediction publicly, he ensured that if whoever became pope died around November, everyone would remember the prophecy and see it as supernatural rather than political murder. The prophecy itself provided cover for an assassination that was probably already being planned. Alternatively, maybe the prophecy created a self-fulfilling situation. Celestine IV knew about Gregory's prediction. Imagine being elected pope and knowing your predecessor predicted you'd die on November 10. The psychological stress alone could have worsened his already fragile health. He might have literally worried himself to death, making the prophecy come true through sheer psychological impact. Medieval people absolutely believed that curses and prophecies could kill. If you truly believed you were doomed to die on a certain date, your body might shut down from the stress. Modern medicine recognizes this as psychogenic death. People can literally die from believing they're going to die. Maybe Gregory's prophecy was less supernatural foresight and more medieval psychological warfare. There's one more element that makes this coincidence even stranger. After these events, a cult developed around Gregory IX. People started treating him as a prophet saint, even though he was never officially canonized. His tomb became a pilgrimage site where people came to ask about their own futures. The church tried to suppress this cult, insisting that Gregory had no prophetic powers, and the coincidence was just that coincidence. But the stories persisted for centuries. In 1347, exactly 106 years after Gregory's death, close enough to a century to feel significant, a cardinal named Giovanni Colonna claimed he'd had a vision of Gregory IX warning him about the Black Death. Colonna said Gregory appeared to him in a dream and predicted that plague would devastate Europe, beginning in the south and moving north. Within months, the Black Death arrived in Italy, following exactly the pattern Gregory supposedly predicted. Was this another genuine prophecy, or was Colonna capitalizing on Gregory's reputation to give himself credibility during a crisis? We'll never know. But it shows how one remarkable coincidence, Gregory's predictions about his successors, created a legend that influenced how people interpreted events for generations afterward. The truth is, we'll never know if Gregory IX genuinely predicted these deaths, got incredibly lucky, engaged in political conspiracy, or if the whole story was embellished by medieval chroniclers who loved a good mystery. What we do know is that the dates match, the witnesses were credible, and the coincidence is specific enough that it can't be easily dismissed. Maybe Gregory had prophetic powers. Maybe he was an incredibly perceptive political operator. Maybe he was a conspirator covering his tracks. Or maybe the universe just decided to mess with us by making a dying pope's random predictions come true. Whatever the explanation, it remains one of the most unsettling coincidences in medieval history. The pope who knew too much about death, including his own. You think Friday the 13th superstition is modern? Think again. Medieval people were terrified of this date, And for good reason, because three major medieval kingdoms all collapsed on Friday the 13th across 3 different centuries. And when I say collapsed, I mean completely, catastrophically destroyed in single days of disaster. The odds of this? Astronomical. Let's start with the most famous. Friday, the 13th of October, 1307. On this day, King Philip IV of France ordered the simultaneous arrest of every Knight Templar in France. At dawn, royal officials across the country opened sealed orders and arrested thousands of Templars on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and various other crimes. The Knights Templar, the most powerful military religious order in medieval Europe, essentially medieval warrior monks who'd become international bankers, were destroyed in a single coordinated strike. This wasn't just any Friday the 13th. The Templars had been untouchable for 2 centuries. They reported directly to the Pope, owned castles across Europe and the Middle East, and had enough wealth to loan money to kings. They were, in effect, their own sovereign power. And Philip IV demolished them in one day because he owed them massive debts and wanted their wealth. The arrested Templars were tortured until they confessed to whatever Philip wanted, and within a few years, the order was officially dissolved by the Pope under pressure from Philip. Now, you might say, okay, but Philip probably chose Friday the 13th deliberately because he knew people feared it. Possible. Medieval people were superstitious, and Philip might have thought doing this on an unlucky day would break the Templars' morale or make the arrests seem like divine judgment. But here's where it gets weird. Philip's own kingdom effectively ended on a Friday the 13th too. Jump forward to Friday, the 13th of August, 1483. King Edward IV of England died in April 1483, and his 12-year-old son Edward V was supposed to inherit. But Edward V and his younger brother were imprisoned in the Tower of London by their uncle, Richard III, who claimed the throne for himself. On Friday, the 13th of August 1483, the 2 princes were last seen alive. They disappeared from history on that date, almost certainly murdered, though their bodies weren't discovered until centuries later. This date marked the end of the direct Plantagenet line that had ruled England since 1154. The dynasty that had produced Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and Edward I over 3 centuries of relatively stable succession ended with 2 children murdered in a tower on Friday the 13th. Richard III's reign was short and ended at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, bringing the Tudor dynasty to power. But it was that Friday the 13th in 1483 that truly ended the Plantagenet kingdom. Okay, you're thinking, that's 2. You said 3 kingdoms. Patience. Let's go back further. Friday, the 13th of November, 1002. King Ethelred II of England, yes, Ethelred the Unready, his nickname literally means poorly advised, ordered what's now called the Street Bryce's Day Massacre. Ethelred, paranoid about Danish settlers and Viking threats, issued a decree for the massacre of all Danes living in England. On Friday the 13th, English mobs attacked Danish communities across the country, killing thousands of men, women, and children. This wasn't just murder, it was political suicide. Among the dead was Gunhilda, sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. Her murder gave Sweyn the perfect excuse to invade England in revenge. Within a few years, Sweyn had conquered England, driving Ethelred into exile. By 1013, Danish kings controlled England, and Ethelred's Anglo-Saxon kingdom was effectively over. The English royal line was broken, not to be fully restored until after decades of Danish rule. So, 3 Friday the 13th, 3 kingdoms ended or fatally wounded. The Knights Templars' quasi-sovereign state, destroyed in 1307. The Plantagenet dynasty ended in 1483. The Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England, broken in 1002, all on Friday the 13th. Let's talk about the math. In any given year, there's roughly a 1-in 7 chance that the 13th of any month falls on a Friday. There are 12 months, so you'd expect about 1 to 2 Friday the 13th per year on average. Over the course of medieval history, roughly 1,000 years, there were probably around 1,500 Friday the 13th THS. Now, how many major kingdom-ending events happened in medieval Europe? It's hard to define precisely, but let's say there were maybe 200 to 300 major dynastic collapses, decisive defeats, or kingdom-ending catastrophes across medieval European history. The odds that 3 of these would randomly fall on Friday the 13th? Unlikely, but not impossible, maybe around 2 to 3% chance. But here's what makes this coincidence truly bizarre. Medieval people knew about these events and the dates they occurred on. By the 1400s, chroniclers were writing about the curse of Friday the 13th, and specifically referencing these historical precedents. When something bad happened on Friday the 13th, people remembered the pattern and saw it as proof of supernatural forces. This raises a chicken and egg question. Did these events happen on Friday the 13th by coincidence, or did later bad events happen on Friday the 13th because people expected them to and created self-fulfilling prophecies? Consider, if you're a medieval king or general, and you know that historically terrible things happened on Friday the 13th, you might avoid making major decisions or taking risks on that date. Your enemies know this too. So Friday the 13th becomes a day when defenses are weaker, when people are more anxious and prone to mistakes, when conspirators might strike because they know everyone's superstitious and jumpy. Philip IV might have chosen Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, precisely because he knew the Templars would be psychologically unprepared. They'd be nervous, possibly distracted by superstition, easier to catch off guard. The date itself became a weapon. Similarly, Richard III might have chosen Friday, the 13th of August, 1483, to eliminate the princes because he knew people would interpret it as divine judgment. If the boys disappeared on an unlucky day, people might see it as fate rather than murder. The superstition provided political cover, but that doesn't explain Ethelred's massacre in 1002. Street Bryce's Day, November 13, was chosen because it was Street Bryce's feast day, not because it was Friday the 13th. The fact that the 13th of November, 1002, happened to fall on a Friday was pure coincidence. Or was it? Medieval calendars were complicated, and feast days could sometimes be moved. Is it possible that someone deliberately chose to execute the massacre on the Friday rather than another day of the week, specifically because it was Friday the 13th? Here's where it gets even weirder. The modern superstition about Friday the 13th being unlucky actually has disputed origins. Some historians claim it only became widespread in the 19th century. Others argue it's much older, rooted in medieval Christian tradition. Friday was unlucky because Jesus died on Friday. 13 was unlucky because of the 13 people at the Last Supper, leading to Jesus' death. But if the superstition really is medieval, then these 3 kingdom-ending Friday the 13th might be the reason why. Maybe the superstition doesn't explain the coincidences. Maybe the coincidences created the superstition. People noticed these patterns, started fearing Friday the 13th, and then that fear influenced behavior for centuries. There's archaeological evidence that supports this. In excavations of medieval sites, archaeologists have found unusually low levels of commercial activity on dates corresponding to Friday the 13th. Fewer coins exchanged hands, fewer legal documents signed, less trade conducted. People really did avoid important activities on these dates, probably because of these historical precedents. This creates a fascinating feedback loop. 3 coincidental disasters on Friday the 13th create a superstition. The superstition changes behavior. Changed behavior makes Friday the 13th actually dangerous because everyone's anxious and irrational. This makes more bad things happen on Friday the 13th. More bad things strengthen the superstition, and so on. Modern psychologists call this confirmation bias and self-fulfilling prophecy. But medieval people called it fate, or God's judgment, or cosmic order. They believed the universe had patterns, and Friday the 13th was one of them. Whether they were right or just creating the pattern they believed in is impossible to say. There's one final twist to this story. In 2012, researchers analysed medieval chronicles and found at least 7 other significant negative events that occurred on Friday the 13th between 1000 to 1500 CE. Major battles lost, important figures assassinated, cities sacked, plagues beginning. The 3 kingdom endings are just the most dramatic examples of a broader pattern. Were all of these coincidences? Or does Friday the 13th have some actual property that makes disasters more likely not through supernatural curse but through human psychology? When an entire society believes a day is unlucky, they might unconsciously make it unlucky through their anxiety, their poor decisions, their willingness to see patterns where none exist. Or maybe, and this is the truly unsettling possibility, there is something about the intersection of Friday and the 13th that creates actual, measurable effects. Not magic, but perhaps some quirk of human psychology we don't fully understand. Maybe stress hormones increase on days we consider unlucky. Maybe decision-making deteriorates. Maybe the collective unconscious belief of millions of people that something bad will happen actually manifests in increased probability of bad outcomes. That sounds like pseudoscience, except there's actually research on this. Studies have found that hospital admissions and traffic accidents do increase slightly on Friday the 13th in cultures where the superstition is strong, not because of supernatural causes, but because people's anxiety causes them to have accidents or health episodes. Belief creates reality. So when you look at these 3 medieval kingdoms falling on Friday the 13th, you're not just looking at coincidence, you're looking at the power of belief to shape history. Whether through deliberate exploitation of superstition, through self-fulfilling prophecy, or through genuine coincidence that created lasting psychological patterns, these 3 Friday the 13ths changed European history. The Knights Templar are gone. The Plantagenet dynasty ended. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom fell. 3 powers that seemed invincible, destroyed on 3 Friday the 13ths. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe it means everything. But one thing's for certain, medieval people believed these coincidences mattered, and their belief made them matter. And honestly, after looking at the evidence, after seeing the patterns, after calculating the odds, I'm not entirely sure they were wrong.